Let's talk about Havoc Gen Zero, a trading card game with giant mechs. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald. In this episode, we're going to talk about an upcoming game that I think is hitting Kickstarter today, actually, as I post this video. But this is a trading card game with giant mechs and aliens and robots, and your players are battling one another in a game called Havoc Gen Zero. This is a prototype. It was sent to me not too long ago by the folks over at Nick Studios, but so the artwork might change and rules and cards might change, but this is the prototype box for Havoc Gen Zero. It's a game for 2 or 4 players, so you can do it as a 2-player duel or play in teams of 2. Kids age 14 and up can figure this one out. Games take 30 minutes to an hour to play. Let's take a deeper look at Havoc Gen Zero from Nick Studios. We are talking about a TCG with tons of cards in this base prototype set. This isn't even the whole deck. I've set aside a deck and put it on the board just so that you could see what things look like. But you are playing this game on a board. You're playing cards to this battleground, and cards are going to move around and activate abilities and attack one another. It's a medium weight strategy game. As I said, kids age 14 and up can figure this one out. It's about medium in terms of its complexity. There are lots of card interactions to keep track of, and you're trying to win this game by defeating the opponent's pilot. One of the things that's interesting, I think, about Havoc is that, of course, your pilot is piloting a mech. So it's really, you're going to have these 2 cards that for a large part of the game are probably going to act as one. The mech goes on top, the pilot is inside. The pilot has some powerful abilities, but if it leaves its mech to use those powers, it's going to be vulnerable to being attacked. So if the pilot's inside the mech, you have to defeat the mech first before you can start attacking the pilot, but a pilot might jump out or be forced out by some of the cards in this game. The mechs and some of the other units in the game also can carry some weapons. And so you've got climbing claws and jetpacks and punch boosters. There's some swords and lasers in here, a rocket launcher. So there are some equipment cards that can be attached to that mech. They're going to go down here where it says mech equipment on the board just so that you can keep track of everything. Some of those long-range weapons actually have ammo counts, so you'll need to keep track of how much ammunition you've used, because once the ammunition is gone, that weapon's not useful anymore. You may even want to just drop it somewhere on the board. Havoc is a TCG, so I showed you that big stack of cards. Before you even play the game, you're going to have to create a deck. The rule book, the prototype rule book that I followed in playing the game, does include some suggested decks if you just want to get into a melee battle or be more tactical about it. There are various suggested decks in that book, but these cards interact together in lots of ways. There are various races or factions that you can put into your deck. You're only going to have 1 mech and 1 pilot, but otherwise you can really create some interesting combos from the cards in the game. The game is played on this giant board. So once you've curated your deck, you're going to set up 1 player on one side, the other player on the opposite side. I haven't played teams in this game, I'll be honest with you. I've only played the 2-player duel version of the game, but you're going to have a deck with various units that you can deploy by paying the cost here at the top right of the card. These units are only going to be deployed to your base. There's this area in the middle that's called the Nicks, I guess Nick Studios it's named after. You're not going to necessarily deploy units out here, although you do have traps and technology that can affect cards in other parts of the board. Each round you're going to have a certain amount of energy to spend to summon those cards and put them on the table. So there's a track here, you can only see it from 6 on, I think, on the way that I've set the board up here. But the first turn you only have 1 EXA or EXA energy, they call it, where you're going to summon these things. So you can only summon very weak cards on the first turn. So you start with 1. The second round there's 2. It just keeps going up and up and up. And when you summon a card, it cannot act immediately. It's kind of in battle prep mode when you first summon it, sort of like summoning sickness. I think even the rulebook mentions summoning sickness as a way to kind of wrap your head around that. But if I summon this giant thing, it can't do anything in the first round that it comes out. So the other player might have a chance to kind of whittle it down a bit and interfere with my plans before I can actually use that card. So you summon units, you use units that were summoned on the previous turns. They can often they can move. They might have a ranged attack where they can fire across the board and damage other characters. There are combinations where if you've got multiple cards of a certain faction, that's going to increase their attack or increase their health, which will allow them to stay on the board longer. You're just spending your points, you're moving those units, you're using their abilities, and you're attacking. Now, one of the things I think is interesting about the game is that you've got ranged attacks, of course, but if you're attacking another unit that's adjacent to you, that's a melee attack, and that unit, even if you kill it, that unit is going to do its damage to your card as well. So it's a bit risky once cards get up next to each other in taking those attacks. As I said, eventually you're going to be attacking that pilot because that's the whole point of the game. Once you get past turn number 8, or if you manage to get a bunch of cards here on the side, these reactor cards, you can bring your pilot out onto the board and the mech. And these are pretty powerful cards, as I said, especially once you get the equipment attached to them. But this is the main card that you're trying to protect as well. And that really is the whole game. I mean, the nuts and bolts of it is in how the cards interact and the various combos and abilities that you've got. You're going to keep playing until one pilot is dead. If you do run out of cards, though, you get one final turn to try and take out the opponent's pilot. But if you're the first one to run out of cards and the other pilot's not dead, then you're going to lose the game too. So there is kind of a time limit here in terms of, because you're drawing cards every turn as well, there's a time limit in terms of how long you're going to spend chasing after that other player's pilot. Once you're out of cards, that's going to be game over. What skills, though, are you practicing when you play a game like Havoc? Well, it is a game where you do need to plan ahead. I mean, even playing your cards to the table, you have to plan ahead because you can't use them right away. So you're planning ahead, you're budgeting the amount of energy that you can spend to put cards on the table, and you're planning ahead in order to capture or defeat that opponent's pilot. And when we are talking about planning, and you're budgeting your energy, you're budgeting the number of cards in your deck as well. You need to think ahead about that because if you run out of cards, you lose the game. And so planning and budgeting are both examples of executive functioning skills, those behaviors and skills that you need to work towards a goal. And your goal here, of course, is taking out the other player's pilot before you run out of cards. It is, though, because you've got a board like this, there's also a visual spatial element to it. The spatial factors being where am I going to move those cards? Where do I summon them so that they'll be safe for a turn until they're ready to take their action and start taking on and attacking the other player's cards that are on the table. So you do get that spatial problem solving in each round. You've got sort of a new puzzle to solve in terms of where you're going to put everything so that you can accomplish your goal. Final thoughts about Havoc. I shouldn't say final thoughts because this is a prototype and things are potentially going to change going forward. But it is a collectible card game or a trading card game that has that science fiction theme. It's been ages since I played a TCG that was a science fiction instead of a fantasy TCG. So that by itself was fun. The art on the cards, even though this is just a prototype, I really enjoyed the art on these cards and the variety with the different factions and the different colored backgrounds. Like these cards are great looking with that artwork. So you've got that fun theme with that the pilot and the mech and all the equipment that you can attach to it, along with the traps and units that you can put on the table. And it is science fiction. The mech, well, I'm using the glider here as the mech, but the mech and the pilot reminded me of a very old game. I don't usually talk about necessarily about different games when I'm reviewing a new one, but years ago, the game that sort of got me into the collectible card games was a Star Wars game by Decipher. And the Decipher Star Wars game had ships with pilots that you could put on them and weapons that you could give your characters, and you would move around to different locations and battle it out with your opponent. In some ways, this reminded me of that, right? Where you've got that little stack of cards. Now, you can give some abilities using the technology to the other units on the table, but really the one card where you've got, the pilot with the mech, that's the main one. So you're not necessarily going to be upgrading everything, but the cards do interact together in fun ways. So there's lots of combos. There's a huge stack of cards, as you saw, and having that mech with the pilot inside is a lot of fun, and when you eject that pilot and he starts using his ability, that's a nice surprise for your opponent for sure. The fact that melee combat is risky because you're going to take damage if you attack an opponent that's adjacent to you, that's a fun strategic element to it as well. And I like that there are cards that you can pull out that will surprise the other players. So it's not just the units that you have to wait a turn, but you've got traps and other abilities that you can take advantage of as you play through the game. Are there downsides, though, to Havoc? Well, I mean, it is 2 players or 4 players. I think it's best at 2. As I said, I haven't played 4, but I wasn't eager to say, oh, let's do this as a team. I do like that 2-player duel when we're playing card games like this on this big kind of board where you've got those 2 sides that you're playing on. There are, in the prototype, a ton of tokens for tracking health and other status effects. But one thing that we did find complicated, in some other games, for example, where you've got a lot of cards on the table that are acting, you don't want that, and the same card can't act multiple times. You might, there's another game that says you're going to tap, Magic the Gathering, you tap your card. If you've got summoning sickness, you can't use the card. It's not coming out face up where you can use it. There's not a token that indicates, oh, this card is in battle prep, it's already been used, or it's just been summoned and can't be used. We sort of had to remember that. That wasn't a problem early in the game, but when you've got, a dozen cards on the table, and some of them can move and some can't, and some of them are duplicates of others, it does get a little bit complicated. So we found ourselves, especially with this board, right, where you've got, it's just the right size to fit. You don't want it to be bigger. It's already a table hog. It's just the right size to fit these cards, so tapping doesn't really work. We just flipped the cards face down and then righted them again at the end of our turn, just so that we remembered what we had done. Similarly, there's not a tracker for the energy that you've spent. So once you get up to 14, say, and you're playing cards that cost 3 or 2 or 1, like that's a bunch of cards that potentially you could be putting out. You need to keep track in your head of how much of that energy you've spent. You're not moving the counter up and down here. So there are a couple of things that we found ourselves needing to keep track of, and without some counter or token to do that, I mean, it's not complicated, but it's just an extra wrinkle. And who knows, those are wrinkles that might be worked out before this game is finally released. Of course, I think I say this every time I talk about a game that has a big stack of cards like this. I'm hoping the box is going to have a good organizer inside, just to keep everything so that it's easy to make a deck, or to keep your deck separate. You might want to make a couple of decks, so if a friend comes over, everything's pre-made. You don't have to sit for an hour sorting through things in order to play a game. So you probably are going to want to have some sort of, I mean, you could do it with baggies, but it would be nice if the box has an organizer inside. And I say that because I say that for every card game that I play. But that, in a nutshell, is Havoc Gen Zero. Thanks so much to the folks at Nick Studios for sending this prototype my way. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can, of course, leave them in the comment section below the video. I do reply to all my comments, so I'll reply to your comments if you leave me one. If you can also email me, of course, at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will go, and the previous ones are already up there. Brains on Games is the X handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, so we're all over the place. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.